Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here, for joining this session 3, Psychosocial Risks and MSDs. Welcome as well to the online participants who joined the session. Just to mention that we have interpretation for this workshop in 3 languages. We have English will be the language used by the speakers. You have Spanish on channel 2 and French on channel 3. My name is Maurizio Curtarelli. I work as a project manager in the Prevention Research Unit at EU-OSHA, and I will be chairing this session today. We have 4 presentations by Richard Greveling, Irene Kloimüller, Cristina di Tecco, and Yves Roquelaure. Malgorzata Milcharek, our interim head of unit, will be concluding the day with a comment on the presentations. Just a reminder to put your mobile devices on silent, and do not forget to hand your interpretation headphone when you leave the room. So I will now give the floor to our first speaker, Richard Greveling. Richard worked as a professional ergonomist at the Institute for Occupational Medicine in Scotland for over 40 years, developing experience in a wide range of industries. 2 strands of his work throughout that time included musculoskeletal disorders and psychosocial risks with a focus on stress. And he had an active involvement with governments, NGOs, and industries in developing a clear understanding of the factors leading to injury or ill health and their prevention. This has included work for a number of institutions, including EU-OSHA. Richard holds a PhD in stress and physical activity and is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, of which he is currently registered. Richard presents on the association between psychosocial risks at work and the occurrence and prevention of musculoskeletal disorders, evidence from the literature. Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurizio. Actually, before I start, rather than just turn these to silent, put them in your pocket or in your bag, because I was sitting in the last session and the number of people sitting there like this. And I'm thinking, this is a musculoskeletal disorders conference. Practice what you preach. No, I'm going to watch you. Sit properly, you. So, right, anyway. First of all, thank you to EU-OSHA for the support for the preparation of this, for the work that went in under carrying this out, and also to my team of colleagues. Who, I'm not going to go through them all here. They're on this slide, and they're mentioned. If you want to know more, read the report, and I can go on from there. So the key thing is what we're interested in is the underlying science. What actually evidence? We heard in the first session about the evidence base. So what evidence is there for what we're talking about? It's not just a gut feeling or common sense, it's what scientific evidence is there. So we looked in the literature, the scientific literature, the peer-reviewed support material to say, well, what can we actually say about musculoskeletal disorders and psychosocial risks? Now, the apologies, you're probably all well aware of this, but it's well accepted, I think, that there are 6 categories of psychosocial risks in the risk factors in the workplace. Demands, control, and some people say there are 7 because they divide support into support by management and supervisors and support by co-workers, conflict of role or lack of role clarity, job security, and violence and bullying at work. And these are a lot of you will be involved in at some level or advocating or promoting risk assessments for psychosocial risk factors. And what this is all about today is actually not just looking at those in isolation, but looking at them in relation to musculoskeletal risk factors. Now, most of the evidence that we found in the literature relates to the first 3 of those 6 factors. Although we did look for evidence for the others, and there was some evidence, but the strongest material, the biggest source of material, was in those first three. And what the evidence shows is that it is clear that there can be a causal relationship between psychosocial risk factors such as demands of work, lack of control and poor support, and the development of musculoskeletal disorders. And we're not just talking about sort of, if you're unhappy at work, you're more likely to get back pain, or you're more likely to report you have back pain. These are interactive effects, that the effects combine, so that the combined effect of the psychosocial factors and the physical factors is worse than looking at the individual factors in isolation. It has to be said that the amount of evidence available isn't always very strong. And in some studies, yes, they've said, well, we can't really say. But one of the important things to come out of it was there was a definite shift in one direction, in that there were very few findings that actually sort of came out and said, no, there is no relationship. So at worst, it was, well, we can't really say. But on the other hand, the evidence was pointing towards there being, yes, there is a clear relationship. Now, we looked at this in some detail. So we said, well, are there particular problems about specific sectors? I mean, health sector, office area, office work, this sort of thing. And there was no real evidence to support that any particular sector or size of company or type of work seemed to be a greater problem. So we're looking at a problem across all types of industry, all types of work. We're not just talking about stress in the office, we're talking about stress in construction work sites, in assembly lines, wherever. And we also looked at the gender issue, because that is seen as, and rightly so, as an important point. And there was no clear gender susceptibility, although there was a degree of evidence that seemed to suggest that female workers are more likely to experience specifically bullying than their male counterparts. The exception to that was probably in those areas of work where there are very few male workers, where they sort of tended to be sort of the butt of a few comments and whatever because of that. But generally speaking, there is a specific problem, or this appears to be a specific problem in relation to bullying female workers. But other than that, it's not really a gender-specific issue. So we have to be concerned across the whole workforce. Another important factor to emerge from our looking at the scientific evidence was that these psychosocial factors don't necessarily work in a negative manner. Good social support from either co-workers or managers can, for example, offset the negative effects of other factors like high job demands. So that's an important point, A, because it's an interesting finding from a scientific perspective, but B, because in my opinion, that points some direction towards actually, yes, doing something about this can be beneficial. It's not just a question of making sure you don't have bad sort of social environment. It's actually that making sure you have a good environment can actually help to reduce the risk. So encouraging a positive way of thinking, positive support from co-workers, managers, whoever, can actually help. You've possibly all experienced that. I certainly have experienced that at a time when you've got a report to get out for EU-OSHA or whatever. There's a lot of things happening all at once, a lot of pressure, a lot of demand, but the team pulled together. It's not, oh, that's not my job, you go and do that. It's, what can I do to help? How can I help you? And that positive environment makes a big difference to the stress and job demands that you're experiencing. And it was also found that some psychosocial factors can actually influence the impact of other factors. And for example, one of the example I give on the slide here is that what's called controlled coping has been found to modulate the impact of job strain on the risk of musculoskeletal disorders. It mentions neck pain because that was a particular type of musculoskeletal or focus for musculoskeletal problems that's had a lot of attention. But essentially, it's if you have a positive way of dealing with and addressing the job strain, then it reduces the risk of injury. And actually, it's called controlled coping because one of the big factors is being in control. And there's a lot of issue at the moment, for example, about, particularly with teleworking and working from home because of COVID, of accessing emails from home. And there's talk about some companies, indeed some countries, have said, no, you must stop this, you must ban this, it mustn't be allowed. Actually, it's more complicated than that. If you feel it's useful for you to see what's happening, I was working with a colleague from Denmark, and she said, I'm going to be on holiday next week, but I'll be keeping on top of things, I'll be seeing what's happening. And I said, why, you're on holiday? And she said, look, I will feel more stress if I don't know what's happening than if I can keep on top of things, and if I can just spend 5-10 minutes looking at stuff. So what help would that person have been if her company had said, no, you're on holiday, shut down your emails? If on the other hand, oh, I've got to look at this because my manager expects me to. He always looks at his on holiday, so he thinks I've got to look at mine on holiday. That's negative. And we actually carried out a study in the Far East, in Singapore, which actually showed this. That if you viewed looking at your emails out of work positively, you were in control of when you looked at them, you saw that as a positive benefit that helped reduce the strain of your job. If, however, you did it because you were expected to, it created all sorts of negative thoughts and negative reactions. So I mentioned this as by way of introduction to these two things that are mentioned here, which you can see about in the literature. They're well publicised, which is basically ways of, when you do an assessment, when you look at the risk, you're not looking at things in isolation, you're bringing them together to assess them as a whole. And it's the same as what some countries do in terms of the physical musculoskeletal factors. They come up with sort of combined indices rather than just looking at weight, just looking at frequency, just looking at something else. You're looking at them all together. And in this context, these concepts, such as demand control support, can be very helpful. And the final point on this particular slide was that we were looking for, do psychosocial factors increase the risk of musculoskeletal disorders? But we also found that it worked the other way around. Musculoskeletal disorders and risks of musculoskeletal disorders can increase the risk of psychological ill health. So it is a two-way thing. We do. So one of the speakers earlier in the earlier session said about taking a holistic approach, and that's very much the case here. We need to look at the whole person. As an aside, we also need to look at the whole person from a more wider perspective in terms of out of work as well. And if we just focus on work, we're not going to deal with these things. And this is apparent. I mean, I told mentioned to someone just before we started, the chap who was being told about toxic chemicals in the workplace and lit up his cigarette while we were telling him about all the toxic chemicals in the workplace and said, what else are you exposing us to? Or you go past the car at the traffic lights and the whole car is going boom, 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 boom. Say, what price of noise-induced hearing loss? Now, we're not just talking about work. And incidentally, those of you from employers, that's not an excuse not to do anything. You can't say, well, we don't need to worry about back pain because they're all doing their backs in, sitting badly, watching Netflix. We have to do what we can so that you can hold your hand up and say, I don't know where you got your back trouble from, but you didn't get it from here. So, psychosocial factors can contribute to the causation of musculoskeletal disorders, but having a musculoskeletal disorder can lead to negative consequences, including poor psychological health. And I did have a quick look. The review that this was based on was reported in 2021. There has been more material published since then, but no real additions to that evidence base to make us want to change what we're saying. One of the things we looked at was the question of models. Can we sort of model to help us picture the relationships between psychosocial factors on the one hand and musculoskeletal risk factors on the other hand? And the short answer is not very easily. It's an interesting academic exercise, and it's a great way, if you like, doing complex diagrams with arrows shooting off here, there, and everywhere, just to show people how mind-bogglingly complicated the whole thing is. It's great. But if you want to use it to help you understand the issues, I think it's probably not going to work very well. Because the models that show, the more you look at the different models, and we looked at a number of different models, the more you found needed to be in that model. And the more things you put into that model, the more complicated it became. And yes, you can draw wonderful arrows and whatever on your computer screen, but it's not, I think, a useful tool from a preventative perspective. So there are pointers that we can put together and did put together in our report for what forms a sort of theoretical ideal model. They don't really fully help, certainly don't help the practitioner, and probably I don't think help people trying to work through policy and procedures on these things. Finally, we looked at the issue of interventions. What evidence is there that actually intervening, of actually changing the psychosocial or musculoskeletal risks in the workplace as a combined thing actually work together, actually is effective? Unfortunately, we found that the evidence base for that is relatively poor. Not because people haven't actually made the changes, but they haven't been sufficiently systematically evaluated in a scientific fashion. One of the problems there, it's actually very difficult to do, and I've done intervention studies myself, so I know this as a practitioner, because if you're doing a drug trial, you give someone a dummy pill and say, there you go, and someone else the real pill, and in the real world, in reality, even the person giving you the drugs doesn't know which one you're getting. How can you do that sort of blind study if you're changing workplaces and changing training and changing this? You know, people aren't daft. They know you've done things, so they know they've been treated. So it defeats the object of trying to carry out, I mean, what's called the gold standard is the double-blind study where nobody knows what they've been exposed to and whatever. You can't do it. So it actually becomes very difficult to evaluate, very complex to evaluate, and it has to be said, as a result, can be quite expensive to evaluate, certainly in a large group. So there's little evidence that is particularly, has been very well evaluated so far. It has to be said, there's not a lot of evidence that a lot of organisations have actually done this. An increasing number are doing psychosocial risk assessments and doing musculoskeletal disorder risk assessments. Psychosocial risk assessments are by HR, musculoskeletal disorder assessments are by the safety department. Do the two departments talk to each other? Yeah. Pigs fly as well, did you know that? So then there's not a lot of evidence of a coming together on this yet. And I think this is one of the big factors that we need to look at. And one of the ways we can advise and encourage is actually to get this combined thinking, this multidisciplinary thinking. But there is a growing awareness of the need for such strategies. So that's a good start. People are recognising they need it. They might not have them yet, but they are recognising that they need them. I think I'm running out of time. I've got 2 minutes. So that's excellent. Okay. So I'm not going to run through all these. I'm sure you'll be getting all the slides and everything sent round to you, so you can read them at your leisure. And my email contacts are there, so you can contact me. I won't read it on weekends and holidays, because I don't read my emails at weekends and holidays. But I will look at them, so don't expect an immediate answer at 3 o'clock in the morning, please. But you will get one in due course. So I think perhaps I'd like to focus particularly on the bottom factor, which is actually being covered to some extent in one of the other sessions. That as well as their role in causing musculoskeletal disorders, physical and psychosocial factors can also create barriers for those returning to work. Now, it doesn't matter whether you've been off with a bad back for whatever reason. When you're coming back to work, oh, it might hurt. I've got a heavy physical job. I find it painful sitting for long periods. I'm worried about it. I'm anxious about it. And that anxiety compounds the problem. So those risk factors are not just important in prevention in the first place, but they're also important in recognising that despite our best efforts, and it was spoken about in the previous session, despite our best efforts, these problems are still there, but we need to do something about what do we do with people who have these problems. And this is one of the key pointers. So, use the risk assessments. Some years ago I did a study on the implementation of the regulations. Yes, we've done our risk assessments. Yes, and what have you done with them? We've done our risk assessments. Yeah, but risk assessment is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Do something about it. Use that information to develop action. And remember that psychosocial factors can work positively. Encouraging a positive working environment can be part of the solution. So, 2 things there. The mind and body should work together and influence each other. And risk assessment is a means to an end, not an end in itself. Thank you.
That was not on purpose. It was not me. It was not me. So thank you very much, Richard. I would like to ask if there are questions from the public for Richard. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for your presentation.
Sorry, can you say your name and institution? Just
yes, I'm Ivan Williams from the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health in the UK. Yeah, you mentioned the thing in terms of gender differences within your own study. I wanted to know if you consider race differences. So, you know, for example, when it comes to vulnerable workers or migrant workers, I don't know, seasonal workers, tend to have also MSDs issues, those working in platform economy, you know, the migrant workforce as well. So did you take into consideration race differences, a part of gender?
Sorry, I couldn't pick up the whole question, but you asking about what we looked at in terms of gender issues?
No, more if you, in addition to gender issues, for example, if you have taken into considerations race, ethnic background issues.
We tried to, is the short answer. But again, there have actually been very few studies published, and what you need to remember is we were looking at the published literature. We were not carrying out our own research. And unfortunately, there's not a great deal out there. I can recall there was one Far Eastern company, I think it was Australian, and I think it was Australian study, but they looked at migrant workers coming in from some of the other Far Eastern countries. And they did show some possible ethnic differences. Unfortunately, in a number of the studies, ethnic differences were, or ethnic background was recorded in order to exclude it. So this was particularly the case in a number of American studies, for example, where race was controlled in the study groups. So you'd have a balance if you're comparing two things, you'd actually balance race within it. And again, if you do epidemiology, if you do these studies, you know if you've controlled for something, it's not varying freely, and therefore you can't analyze it. So unfortunately, the gender issue wasn't looked at in relation to other. I mean, there's actually very few studies that just looked at gender, even without taking these other factors into account. But no, there's no great material out there to build anything from.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions from online participants?
We do. We have a question from Horacio Covita, and the question is, what's the role of self-regulation and job crafting strategies and approaches in interventions in risk reduction?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, of course.
Give me more time to think.
What's the role of self-regulation and job crafting strategies and approaches in interventions in risk reduction?
Very good question. And do you want an opinion or an answer? I think I would. Do you want an opinion or the evidence base? The evidence base is there isn't a lot of evidence. The opinion is, I think there are big problems now. I mean, we talked about the changing work environment. How do you define a workplace? I'm a professional ergonomist. On occasion, we do consultancy work. I went in to do some work for one company, and this lady's workplace, her workstation, was a laptop, nothing else, on her bedside table. You know, you look at the display screen equipment directive and say, how do you fit that together? So I think there needs to be, and the core of that is that it's self by the individual. That particular directive, for example, places some emphasis, a lot of emphasis on information and training, education and training. Education rather than training, actually, because you educate people, you train dogs. So what you need is people to educate them to understand why they need to work in a particular way, why they need to take care of themselves, and how they can do something about it. And that's increasingly important, unless you're going to start visiting everybody in their home, and I've done that for some companies. Unless you're going to start visiting all the people in their home, you are relying on individual regulation, individual control, and you're relying very much on the individual worker.
Okay, thank you very much. I will give now the floor to Irene Kloimüller, Irene is a trained medical doctor, healthcare manager, and psychotherapist. Since 1995, her work has focused on maintaining and regaining workability and return to work. In 2012, Irene built up the Austrian national program Fit to Work, and is currently co-director of the postgraduate course Workability and Reintegration at the Medical University of Vienna. She assesses organizations, awarding them the Nestor Gold Quality Seal on behalf of the Austrian Ministry of Social Affairs for adapting their work environments to the needs of their aging workforces. She's a consultant and expert in workability, age management, and return to work. And she presents on return to work after MSDs-related sick leave in the context of psychosocial risks at work. Irene, thank you.
Thank you very much. I missed Bilbao. I had a withdrawal Bilbao, so I'm glad to be here back again. I will focus on return to work, and I will slip the first slides because Richard did a perfect introduction, and I can link to this introduction very well. So you can read afterwards the definition. So I'm talking about work-related musculoskeletal diseases and psychosocial risk factors and how they are linked together, what you have to emphasize, focus on when returning to work. And it's very important that you have all different, you have the workers and the companies in participating in this, because they all have consequences, positive as negative consequences. We can see a loss of individual health, quality of life, a decreasing economic status for the workers. If they have work-related musculoskeletal diseases, we can see on the company level problems, quality of work, absence from work, presentism, and so on, early retirement, which is now a great deal or a story in Austria, not only in Austria, in whole Europe, because we need the people to stick in the work process, and also, of course, on the macro level. So why I'm mentioning this is we all have a win if we look at returning to work with MSDs. And we can see when we look and focus on the psychosocial stress or risk factors, they have a major impact on recovery and returning to work. And that's what I will talk about. And first, and it was mentioned before, for early intervention, it's very important, and early intervention is first step before returning to work, before we return to work. It's very important to look at the whole range of risk factors. This was mentioned by Richard, and this is, I think, not a new finding, but it's still, we have still problems. We have different people looking at the risk factors and not linking them together, in Austria at least. Yeah? So, and for the return to work with MSD, we always make an ad hoc assessment, and here the whole range of risk factors have to be assessed. Yeah? So, and they should cover not only the psychosocial risk factors separated by the psychologists, but they should be linked together with the physical risk factors, organizational risk factors, social risk factors, and so on, and the new emerging risks. And I think this is a very important thing to do, to link it together, the assessments, and this is in the return to work process, you will see, very important. So what do we talk about, or what does return to work concept aim to? They aim to facilitate the reintegration of the worker after long-term sick leaves. Of course, early intervention aims to avoid a long period of sick leaves, but they are part of the first step, you could say. They help to resume the work task again and to achieve a sustainable retention, to support the workers with reduced workabilities or the capacities and capabilities, to help to recover by work from the health, to reduce the long-term disabilities, and of course to maintain the workers at work. And I think very important is that we have people with chronic MSDs related to work, and maybe they will never have 100% fit again, but with adequate adjustments at the workplace and focusing the workers' capabilities, not only the limitations they have, and this is very important, they might still be working lifelong, and this is very important. Maybe we don't recover from the whole range, but if we adjust the workplace, we might be able to work lifelong. So what I did is from the studies, I read a lot of studies produced by Richard, EU-OSHA and other experts, and from my personal experience, I put them I categorized them. And so I want to show you the prerequisites responsible for a good return to work process. And this is maybe true for all return to work process, but it's also very special for MSD. So first we need a health policy and integrated OSH management at the top level, addressing promotion, prevention, and a defined return to work process because they are policy, they're linked together. And here you need again this holistic assessments. This is very important to enable a smooth return. And of course, and this was mentioned, the culture. It was mentioned in the presentations in the morning, and it was mentioned by Richard. If you have a healthy culture and a good communication, it creates an atmosphere, even if you have problems, and a supportive culture where it's easier to return to work. You have to have incentives, and maybe this is an answer on the online question. An incentive doesn't mean like to pay money for returning early. I don't think this is useful, but to have workplace-oriented interventions to support, not only on the medical side, but also on the psychological side, or we give you an example later on, also on the social worker side sometimes, financial liabilities, and so on. You have to build awareness in the company, especially with the line managers, because they have to support the return to work process. If they don't do this, it's very difficult for workers to return to work, because as you will see later on, the psychosocial risks are also, of course, you have psychosocial support with the line manager, but you also have risks there. So, and you have to train people, of course, in the company to be aware of the problems and the facilities you have. Professional multidisciplinary support, internal and external service. In Austria, and like in many other countries, we have internal and external service, and it's very important to get the professional support in the process. And this does not only mean medical support, or it's like I said before, psychological coaching, for example, or psychotherapy. Or also social work can be part of the vocational rehabilitation process of the return to work process. The social support by the line manager was already mentioned before. Also not the social support from the line manager, but also from the colleagues. If you don't talk with the colleagues, somebody returning with musculoskeletal diseases at the workplace, and they have to do things for the colleagues, and they are not like taken in the process, you will have less social support. And social support is one of the key factors to support people to coming back to work. Competence building is linked to awareness rising and then competence building. It was, we trained a lot of, inside in the company experts, and we have a lot of expertise now already also outside the companies, but it's very important and we have to continue there. And most of all, of course, not only the worker, as I will mention, has to do something like medical treatment or physiotherapy. It's very important to do the things at the workplace, on the level of the workplace. Adapt the work equipment, give the worker time to use to it, change, swap, rotate. However, be creative, use your fantasy, be flexible. The less flexible a company is, the less they are doing on the workplace level, and this is very important, these adjustments. Allow a gradual return to work. It's with MSD important, because you have to check if the interventions you have work. You have to see if the workers can cope in the context. If the social support helps. You have to give the worker the feeling that he can control the situation, and even to change the gradual return to work process. In Austria, we have like 3 to 6 months, depending. You use the right timing, not too early and not too late. Too early means after 1 week, we will not offer maybe a return to work process. We'll stay in contact with the worker, but at least the latest 6 to 8 weeks, yeah, you should have a process, yeah, to address the worker and to support him. Customize the work. Even if we are reducing standards, so we're trying to build up standards with return to work process, still then with the standard, within the standard you have to customize the process, yeah? And then of course review and make performance tracking. And this is still, I think, a point we are doing too little, or we are not looking, we're looking if somebody is coming back and he's staying, but we are not looking what worked really, what worked well, what went well, yeah, what indicators. And I think the Australians have done a good job there. They looked at lag and lead indicators, and I think there was a good publication about this. I want to also see, I now mentioned responsibilities on the company side, but there are also responsibilities on the worker side. There are prerequisites they have to take in. If you have OSH standards, the worker of course have to stick to the standard. Like Richard mentioned, yeah, if you're always doing this the whole time and you're not, we have all this ergonomic equipment, but you're not using it in the right way, yeah, or you're like mobbing or bullying or something doing, then you're not sticking to the standards. So yeah, of course you have to stick to the standards, it's complying with the OSH standards. And of course there's a kind of self-management. We train the people to have a self-management of health problems, but it has to be linked together with the workplace adjustment. Only individual management is not enough. Yeah? You have the trust and the will to talk, yeah, but this is also linked to the culture, as I mentioned before. If you have a healthy culture and open communication, then there must be the will to talk about your situation. Sickness, MSDs, often, it's difficult to talk about it. Maybe you have fear that you have problems later on, so it's important. And you have to have a positive attitude about returning to work. You have to get involved personally. If you don't really, you think it's an option, good option to return to work, then you will not succeed. We could see that in this over 10 years, watching companies doing this, if the workers, you did not think it was useful to them, yeah, we were not successful. And then, of course, have an active participation. Yeah, yeah. And as an example I will show later on, it's important to stay with the company during the sick leave. And I will now, to summarize this, give an example. And it's an example from, you heard today the award of the Austrian hospital, and it is an example taken from this department there, because really they did a great job. I don't know if they are now here in the audience, yeah, but it's an example from them. It was a 52-year-old woman, a cleaner, a migrant worker. We have a lot of migrant workers in the hospital doing cleaning services. I think this is maybe everywhere. She was working full-time. She was making no night shifts, but she had weekend shifts. She was a very reliable lady and a well-respected worker, or she is. She's still there, but she's older now. This example is from 2 years ago. She had a lower back pain for longer times, short periods of sick leave and treatments, and also already some adjustments were made. So there was an assessment, a risk assessment already made, and some adjustments, organizational changes were made, but they were not successful. So after some time, she had an incomplete lumbar disc prolapse with medication and rehabilitation. She had sick leave for 2 months, and the worker stayed all the time in contact with her line manager. So now you can see the process, and I tried to emphasize or highlight what are the aspects I mentioned before. So first they had a standard. After 3 weeks, automatically every worker is contacted and invited for a first review or interview. Even if they are not ready prepared to return to work, it's important, to talk about it. Yeah, not to make pressure, but to talk about it. And so they were talking, they had this policy, OSH policy with a standard, and they were talking and saying, okay, we can offer you support, take your time, but it's important that we start to talk about it, how you can return to work. Huh? And already after 3 weeks, even if she returned then later on, they tried to make a plan, and this plan was made together with the education plan was made together, produced together with the OSH team, her line manager, and her. So it was a participative approach. and with professional and management support. And it, working together in these three was very important. And again, an ad hoc assessment, a holistic, was carried out, and the equipment was changed. It was of course clear she would not climb on ladders, she would not have too heavy liftings, and her work schedule was changed. Some organizational changes were made. And after 2 months, she gradually, step by step, returned to work, and the gradual process was 3 months. She could make breaks whenever she needed it, so this was, and she could make her exercises in the breaks, so she could take this time, and this was quite clear. That was no problem. She was integrated in a new small working team who was informed and willing to support, so social support, and a very appreciative interaction. And the social worker, and this was like another external expertise, organized to help her with her financial liabilities, because she was out of sick leave, and then you get a little bit less money, and she had financial problems. So they organized not only the OSH team, but also the social worker to support her to cope with this. And her line manager only took 5 minutes every day to talk with her how she was feeling. And after in the interview, I did an interview with her, and she said this was the most appreciated thing. It was so helpful for her that the line manager was addressing her how she is and how she's coping. So you can see this is a very, I think, simple example, but it shows well the psychosocial support also in this, with this MSD. So summarizing, and I hope I'm in time. 2 minutes, okay. 5 minutes, okay, I'm too quick, I'm too fast. But summarizing, what is necessary to have a good return to work with MSD? You have to have a high OSH standard, based on regular assessments, and these assessments should be holistic assessments covering all the range of the risk factors, not separate physical and organizational and psychosocial risks linked together. You can do it in a team, You can do it with a safety manager, an occupational health doctor, with a psychologist, but it's important to, or the ergonomic experts, but linked together, a holistic approach. This is for prevention and return to work necessary. You have, of course you have to apply the general principles of OSH prevention, as also in psychosocial risk factors. I mentioned these holistic risk assessments. We have a lot of examples where we can see this is not working still. We have to have early interventions to adjusting the work. We have to have the talks about it, the people have the culture, that it's easy to talk about it and make small adjustments. Even when the people are still here, this is necessary. And then you have to really shape or make the workplace intervention accommodations completed by individual measures. But it's a two-phase, a two-way story. You have the organizational factors in the individual measures taken. Usually we put them in an integration plan, we call them, and we put down in this paper what the organization is doing about this and what I'm going to do about this, and we are checking if it's done. And you have to create a culture of positive and supportive attitude. This is very important. Psychosocial factors, supportive factors, they are working in two ways, as Richard said. And then this multidisciplinary approach. Of course, we need the occupational health doctors, but we need the psychologists, the psychotherapists, physiotherapists, social workers. We need all them together in working with return to work. And the shared responsibilities, so you cannot, as workers, say, okay, organization, just do and work. You have to share, and opposite, of course, the organization has to do her story. So, and I'm finishing my presentation. If you want to read more about this, we have a discussion paper, and I want to say thank you to Michael Shatter and to Maurizio, who supported me in writing this discussion paper. It's an 18 pages discussion paper covering the whole stories and cases about psychosocial risk factors, MSD, and return to work. And we would be very pleased if you could read it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irene. Just to mention that all the presentations that we have this afternoon are based on papers and reports that are available on our website, so you can download them from our website. Questions from you, from the public? No questions. We have a question from the speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Irene. Very interesting and very glad to see we agree on these things. I have a question. I don't know how it varies in Austria, but I wonder, have you any evidence of involvement of the primary care side of things? I'll tell you why I'm asking. A few years ago, I met a lady who had chronic wrist and hand problems. And her opening remarks to me were, my doctor, and being a doctor, he must know what he was talking about, my doctor has told me I will never work with computers again. Well, what hope has your employer got? No, when the doctor has told me this. So is there any evidence of involving primary care people?
We are trying to do this, but it's a very hard part of the story, yeah? Because there are different systems linked together, and we're trying also to train the medical doctors, not just to say, okay, take sick leave and it's good for you and stay long at home and then sometimes return, but we're trying to train them. So this was part of the Fit to Work program to get the medical doctors to address them, yeah, but actually we were partly successful, I would say. It's still a long way we have to go, and I read the studies about other countries, and I think it's everywhere. I think it's very similar in other countries. Yeah?
Yeah. Just a plug there. I don't know if it's still live, but there was a Working Back Scotland website. And one of the messages that we promoted, which went to general practitioners and everybody, was don't take black plane lying down. And saying to GPs, no, don't just send your patient home for bed rest, was an important part of that project.
Social insurance is now addressing also the medical doctors, and they are inviting the patients to come to the social insurance, and they are also looking what the medical doctors are doing, and so they put a little pressure. But Austria is a small country. We have 9 counties in Austria, and we see even in these 9 parts of Austria big differences how social insurance are, addressing the medical doctors. But this is, I think, one step that worked. Yeah, and we have a law where you have this gradual return to work, where they are inviting the patients and seeing who's treating them, and so they're trying to do this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Irene, for a very nice overview of all the factors that contribute to return to work. However, this is a description of a classical organization with an employer, a worker, and I think Richard, in his earlier speech, raised the question quite honestly, how do you define a work situation? There are millions of self-employed workers in Europe. So how could we reach out with these sort of findings to those self-employed workers? How on earth do they think of a multidisciplinary approach or whatever? Do you have any ideas about this, or do we have any ideas about this?
I can only answer this for Austrian situation. Yeah? I'm also self-employed. I have my own company, 2 employees, yeah? So I'm not a big company. So you have external services. They are now better known. They are free of charge, where you can get support. Yeah? But still, you can see the more organized the company is, the easier it is to follow the standard. What we have now seen is with remote work, it's working quite well, because you now can also address remote workers and participate in the interventions and so on. This is now starting to work. It was, I think, accelerated with the COVID thing. With self-employed, we can see in the statistics, they have very few sick leaves because they can't afford actually to do this. So then we have to go over this external expertise to address them. But it's not so easy, I think. So this is the only thing what is done now about this.
Okay, thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Cristina Di Tecco for the next presentation. Cristina is an occupational psychologist and a researcher in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, Epidemiology and Hygiene in the Italian Institute for Insurance Against Accidents at Work, INAIL. She contributed to the development of INAIL's methodology for the assessment and management of work-related stress and supports organization in the psychosocial risk management through tailored tools. She contributed on the WHO-ILO joint methodology and estimates of work-related burden of disease and injury with the systematic reviews on long working hours and stroke and long working hours and depression. She holds a degree in psychology and a PhD from the University of Rome, La Sapienza. Cristina, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for many thanks to EU-OSHA for inviting me. I am very pleased to join this event. My presentation focuses on some evidence and main strategies and future challenges in the prevention of musculoskeletal disorders and psychosocial risks in the workplace at European and Italian levels. According to the WHO's work-related disorder definition, we recognize the multifactorial etiology of work-related MS disease that led to a flourished use of multi-causal models in the field of occupational health prevention, a combination of individual, physical, psychological, social, and work-related aspects should be included indeed in the study of MS disease determinants above biomechanical and ergonomic aspects. Further, occupational and non-occupational factors showed a clear link with MS disease, such as demographic and individual characteristics, health conditions, unhealthy behaviors, and new and emerging risk. And among the others, psychosocial and organizational factors such as high workload, high demands, low social support, low job control, low job satisfaction, and monotonous work are aspects raising the risk of MS disease, especially when combined with physical risks. They have assumed increasing relevance in the study of determinants of MS disease over time. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic brought about rapid changes in the world of work, workplaces, and the workforce, drawing attention on psychosocial risks as one of the key priorities in policy and practice for the future of work. And rapid changes have bringing the exacerbation of some existing psychosocial risks and the emergence of new ones. MS disease are one of the most common work-related disorders that in Europe affect millions of workers and cause a huge social cost in terms of health and loss of productivity. In particular, around 60% of European workers declaring work-related health problems identify MS disease as the most serious problem, and around 3 out of 5 workers in Europe report suffering from MS disease. In Italy, this percentage was slightly below the European mean score. In recent years, there has been a decrease in perceived exposure for all physical and ergonomic risk factors, with the exception of work done with computers, laptops, and smartphones, which has grown significantly from 47% in 2005 to 58% in 2015. This tells us a lot about the progress made in preventing more traditional risk factors and how much emerging risks need to be addressed. According to the INAIL's report on accident and occupational diseases, MS disease in the workplace is a growing phenomenon in Italy. In 2008, MS disease accounted for less than 40% of the total reported occupational disease, while their incidence was almost 70% in 2020. And looking at the trend of the last 5 years, we find an increase of 3.13%. Even if Italy generally reports a prevalence of MS disease slightly below the European average, national data on workers' perception of health and safety at work highlights a high level of attention on musculoskeletal health. The 2019 findings of the Italian National Survey on Perception of Health and Safety at Work reported that ergonomic and biomechanical risks rank second among the risks to which workers feel exposed, immediately after work-related stress and psychosocial risks. Moreover, musculoskeletal pains accounted for 42% of pains reported by workers. Secondary analysis that are showed in the graphic reported a slight reduction in musculoskeletal pains suffered by workers in the 6 months prior the survey from 2013 to 2019 in all the 3 musculoskeletal areas considered. 2019 data made it possible to investigate the link between musculoskeletal pains and psychosocial risks at work and the lack of well-being in a wide representative Italian sample with over 8,000 workers. Findings reported a significant correlation between all the 3 areas of musculoskeletal pains and several psychosocial factors at work, with the exception of job insecurity, and also with self-report lack of well-being. When crossing the 3 musculoskeletal pains considered, with the level of work-related stress risk exposure, we found that as the perceived risk exposure increases, the percentage of workers with one of the musculoskeletal pains increases too. In particular, workers reporting to have suffered back pain in the last 6 months before the survey are the 60% of those with a very high exposure to work-related stress risk. It is interesting to note that the same results were found using a broader measure of workers' well-being, namely the WHO Well-being Index. Indeed, we found that when well-being decreases, the percentage of workers with at least one of the MS disease increases. This is particularly evident for back pain. Promoting and maintaining health across the life course requires a renewed focus on improving musculoskeletal health at European and national levels. The need for focus on musculoskeletal health at work has been recognized and addressed at European level by the adoption of a number of European directives, strategies, and policies over time. The same is done for work-related stress. The current EU-OSHA campaign plays a remarkable role in promoting well-being at work and in preventing MS disease, and also in improving knowledge and new and emerging risks associated with MS disease, to disseminate information about how they can be effectively prevented and managed. The current strategic framework on health and safety at work remarks the need for anticipating and managing risk and identify priority to inform the development of OSH practices and policies. And one of the main areas is stress and psychosocial risks and their link with workers, and these include also the link with MS disease. So, in consideration of the multifactorial nature, the main challenge in preventing work-related MS disease is advancing a multidisciplinary approach to health policy and strategies at European and national levels, to boost the development of models, approaches, and practical tools oriented towards assessing and managing all the potential determinants of MS disease in an integrative manner. Thus, MS disease prevention efforts must be based on an holistic and multidisciplinary and integrated approach that combines public health intervention with occupational health interventions, promoting a link between workers' health, work organization, and work environment in terms of protection, prevention, and promotion. And this in the view of the aging of the workforce and the rapid changes to the world of work. In conclusion, some key points that emerge from the Italian case with suggestions for future developments. Work-related MS disease still represents a significant global health problem. The multifactorial etiology requires the use of multi-causal model for the occupational health prevention. Psychosocial and organizational factors raise the risk of MS disease, especially when combined with physical factors. We are assisting to the exacerbation of some existing psychosocial risks and the emergence of new ones due to the rapid changes of the world of work. And the management of MS disease has been going towards a renewed focus on improving musculoskeletal prevention, health prevention in the workplace using multifactorial models. The main challenge is advancing a multidisciplinary approach to health policy and strategy toward integrated models to assess and manage all the potential determinants of MS disease, including those related to psychosocial factors. This presentation is also based on a discussion paper published by EU-OSHA. I want to thank you, Maurizio and Małgorzata, for the effort done to help us in supporting us in publishing this discussion paper. And many thanks to you.
Thank you very much, Cristina. I would open the floor for questions. Any questions? Maybe we have questions from online participants.
Or a general question from Sandra Kruicht. She says, an important question was asked previously about the self-employed. A huge number of self-employed, for example, in the Netherlands, around 1 million, are not always included in communication, campaign, policies, etc. Are you also of the opinion that it is important that all policies, campaigns, etc. address health and safety of the self-employed as well? Would you agree that the high number of self-employed and the fact that they are largely unknown with all legislation and policies regarding work is a major risk for the coming years? And would you call this a major change in work we have to include, just as digitalization is included? So I think that's a general question to the panel.
General question.
Maybe you'd like to pick it up at the end.
I'm the chair. You cannot ask question to me. No, I'm joking. But
maybe
yeah.
At the end, if there's enough time, you could.
Yeah,
could address
we
it.
will. In the digitalization campaign, definitely we will consider as well the self-employed, but maybe you can tell us if this Insula data were covering as well self-employed or were only employees in this data. So
okay, we don't cover self-employers, but only we have a little part of self-employment, but most of the sample is on organization and company, so I cannot address about them. The reason is that the Insula data are mostly related to the perception of health and safety linked to the national decree on health and safety. So that is the reason for what we include only organization and company, only a little part of self-employed.
Thank you very much. Do we have any additional questions? Okay, so thank you very much, Cristina. And we have now the final presentation by Yves Roquelaure. Yves is a professor of occupational health at the University Hospital of Angers and director of the Regional Center of Occupational and Environmental Diseases of the University Hospitals of Pays de la Loire region. Sorry for my French. He is the founder and director of the research team Esther of the Institute of Research on Environment, Health and Work, which is the main French academic research unit in occupational medicine. He conducted several epidemiological studies on risk factors for musculoskeletal disorders and intervention studies to prevent MSDs and improve return to work after MSDs. He published over 300 scientific papers in international journals and national journals. The title of his presentation is Psychosocial Risk Factors for Work-Related MSDs in the Context of New Forms of Work and Digitalization. I would like to mention that I chose this as final presentation for today because in a way it's a presentation that gives us a glimpse into the research program on digitalization and also in the next campaign that will start from 2023. So Yves, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurizio and Malgorza, for having invited me and given the opportunity to present this synthesis of the literature on the relationships between psychosocial risks and MSDs in the specific context of the new forms of work and digitalization of the economy. In introduction, I would like to remind you that we are living an unprecedented period of economic, industrial, technological, and social revolutions following the digitalizations of the economy and the spread of new forms of work. This is a multifaceted phenomenon covering a wide range of jobs and working conditions and which associates in various proportions information and communication technologies, robotizations in all forms, of jobs to carry out routine and non-routine manual and cognitive tasks, and with manual robots, but also material robots, but also and above all virtual robots based on algorithms and artificial intelligence, allowing algorithmic production process management and control. And a new business model, the so-called online platform economy, with omnipresent big data, with omnipresent access to digital platforms, online outsourcing of micro-work performed by low-qualified crowd workers, and online freelancing on the other side of high-qualified self-employed, and the self-employed are growing because of the development of the new forms of work and employment. Presently, platform works represent almost 5% of the workforce, 3% 2 years ago. It's growing fast. And the new forms of work lead to a workforce ever more diverse, dispersed, and in precarious employment with self-employed, forced self-employed, employees sharing, and zero hours contracts. The digitalization of the economy is accelerating long-term trends of changes in work organizations and working conditions that start more than 2 decades ago, and digitalization is reinforcing work intensifications and psychosocial factors at work. The COVID-19 pandemic had and will have a strong impact on the European workforce with delayed effects as shown by the 5 rounds of the Living, Working and COVID-19 e-survey. Shortly speaking, we observe since the beginning of the pandemic an acceleration of the transition of work toward online and virtual environments. For example, teleworking jumped up to 40% in Europe in April 2020 and remained at high level in 2021 and 2022. Similarly, hybrid work, virtual work, and e-communications expand drastically. For many workers, working during the pandemic was a new experience of work, often associated with lasting change in their perspective on work. Teleworking, at least partial, becomes a new norm of work for about a third of the European workers. And the pandemic changed for some of them the meaning of work, increased for others the risk of social isolations, and may have led to work disengagements for others. The pandemic have and will have major OSH consequences, with increased work intensity for many essential life-sustaining workers and higher levels of psychosocial distress in some home-based teleworkers and virtual team workers. This slide shows, for example, the distributions of work locations of the European worker since the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see that if teleworking in blue declines after the peak of 2020, the first lockdown, home-based work remains at higher level than before the pandemic, less than 10%. Above all, hybrid work, defined by working both in the usual workplace and at home, has developed and remained at a high level in 2022. In 2022, almost a third of the workers work in telework, at least partially. This corresponds to the wishes of many workers, especially women, and many blockages related to business and regulations have fallen during the first pandemic peaks. In the context of the new forms of work, two categories of work situations are at risk of MSDs and should be considered. Almost two risk models for MSDs. The first category corresponds to sedentary work, which is associated from a motor point of view, from a physiologist point of view, to prolonged motor tasks of low intensity, leading to a form of underutilizations of the soft tissue. This refers for the specialists to the Cinderella models or the Brussels models established 20 years ago. In this case, the biomechanical factors are mainly prolonged constrained posture and sitting postures. Psychosocial factors and stress play a significant role in the onset or maintenance of the disorders. The main disorders in this case are non-specific disorders, such as chronic pain of the neck, shoulder, and back. The workers at risk are the cognitive workers performing visually demanding tasks and new forms of sedentary work. The second category is more classical and corresponds to manual work that will not disappear in the digital economy, where many workers will continue to perform dynamic and intense motor tasks, leading to soft tissue overuse. The biomechanical factors are classical, repetitive and forceful movement, posture, vibrations, and psychosocial factors play a lesser role than for non-specific disorders. The affections are non-specific and also specific, mainly tendinopathies of the shoulder and elbow, or nerve entrapment such as CTS. The workers at risk are the manual workers performing physically demanding tasks in traditional jobs or in the new jobs of the digital economy, such as warehouse workers in e-retail distribution centers. Automations and digitalizations can have a contrasted impact on the biomechanical risk factors for MSDs. Generally speaking, exposure to strenuous physical work and ergonomic risks should decrease with the use of robots, cobots, and exoskeletons for manual work. The reductions in biomechanical exposure will be possible in various jobs at high risk of MSDs in manufacturing, logistics, constructions, and agriculture. However, this reduction will probably be unequally applied across work situations, and biomechanical exposure may even increase in some categories of workers. For example, warehouse workers employed in large online retail distribution centers, working under time pressure and constant supervision, with voice speaking, for example, or assembly line workers in lot-size manufacturing on the other side. On the other hand, the new forms of sedentary work will continue to develop in the future. namely in on-screen control and monitoring activities in the production sectors, smart factories, for example, or in online service platforms, or during teleworking and work at home. These new forms of work are expected to increase the time spent sitting, and in addition, sedentary work could reduce the level of daily exposure, daily energy expenditure, and daily exercise, contributing to an increased risk of overweight, obesity, and diabetes, and by this, to increase the risk of MSDs. Considering the psychosocial factors, the new forms of work and digitalization will reinforce the current shifts in patterns of exposure to workplace hazards in Europe. This will increase the number of European workers being exposed to psychosocial factors at work, such as high task repetitiveness, high cognitive workload and psychosocial demands, permanent electronic monitoring of worker performance, algorithmic management of productions and human resources. This will have a varied resulting impact on the main organizational and psychosocial risk factors from MSDs, depending on the context. And the factors are intensity of work, autonomy and job control, quality of the social relations at work, job insecurity, emotional demands at work, and in the specific case of work at home, working times and boundaries and blurred boundaries between work and personal life. Such exposure to psychosocial factors may partially counterbalance the expected reductions of the physical workload. Considering work intensity, the digital economy is expected to further increase the work intensifications observed in Europe for 2 decades. The spread of the production driven by artificial intelligence and algorithmic management will optimize worker task assignations, will maximize the cognitive and physical workloads, but also will maximize the risk of job strain. This may contribute to increase the proportions of workers experiencing cognitive overload, digital fatigue, mental exhaustion, and various forms of techno-stress. For example, teleworkers and ICT mobile workers are known to experience greater work intensity and level of stress than the other. And the digitally induced work intensification seems to mediate negative mental effects rather than the use of the ICT per se. Thus, the job constraint has a major influence with, generally speaking, on the one hand, creative and mentally demanding high-tech jobs with large autonomy and employing high-skilled workers or self-employed, and on the other hand, physically and mentally demanding monotonous repetitive jobs at high risk of MSDs and employing low-skilled platform workers. Considering autonomy and job control, the digitalization may either reinforce or diminish workers' autonomy, depending on ergonomic design, management practices, and implementation strategies. On the one hand, mobile workers and teleworkers experience greater autonomy at work and working time autonomy when they volunteer, it is important, for these forms of work. On the other hand, platform workers have very limited autonomy due to algorithmic management and permanent controls. The gain in autonomy may be nevertheless paradoxical, since the gain in independence may be counterbalanced by the feeling to be obliged working everywhere and all the time. The digitalizations of the economy may introduce new forms of digital taylorism under the cover of new technologies. This is the case in the manufacturing industry, when collaborative robots with automated decision-making influence assembly line workers, or in work situations driven by artificial intelligence, combining very low decision latitude with high psychosocial demand under time pressure. Such situation may be worse than similar tasks in the traditional assembly line. This is also the case in the service industry with algorithmic management and digital surveillance, introducing new forms of Taylorian management in office-like jobs that were previously preserved. Considering the quality of the social relations at work, automations and algorithmic management in various occupations and jobs will increase the number of people working remotely, often individually, without contact with colleagues or even in competitions with them. Full-time teleworking may reduce social informal interactions at work, either with colleagues or managers, and this can be detrimental in terms of informal learning, instrumental support, social and emotional integrations, and organizational trust between colleagues and managers. Such physical and social isolation may increase the occurrence of job isostrain situations, and by this, the risk of MSDs. Unfair pay and procedure inconsistencies may reinforce the feeling of effort-reward imbalance, which is a risk factor for MSDs, and the lack of information on how algorithm works may affect the sentiments of organizational justice, which is a risk factor for stress and possibly for MSDs. Job insecurity is expected to increase due to the diversity and precariousness of some employment forms in the digital economy, sometimes called gig economy. Emotional demands at work may be influenced by management practices like permanent surveillance and or public evaluations, rating system requiring hiding feelings and adopting permanent positive attitude to maintain a good rating and preserve employability, and this despite unfair or conflictual relationships with customers and requesters. Increasing working times and blurred boundaries between work and personal life are important issues for home-based teleworkers who often report blurred boundaries between work and personal life despite reduced commuting time due to longer working hours and poor work-life balance. This was observed at the beginning of the pandemic. It's not sure that it's the same presently. And in the literature, conflicting effects on health and well-being are described depending on contextual factors, including home office ergonomics, work organizations, voluntariness, and informal agreement between employees and managers. So in summary, if the digitalization of the economy will influence exposure to the main physical, psychosocial, and organizational risk factors for MSDs, the resulting risks are difficult to predict, as the risk will depend on the economic sectors, occupation, socio-economic position, and the specific management context of each work situation. In terms of preventions, the digital technologies create new OSH risks, but offer also opportunities to improve the preventions of MSDs in various ways: reduction of physically demanding and repetitive or routine tasks, ability to provide higher levels of autonomy and flexibility, reductions of commuting time and fatigue, better access to labor market, and better job retention of aging workers, disabled workers, and those with care duties at home. But this will depend on the context. The digitalization will also allow the development of advanced technologicals and digital tools for risk assessment, such as smart device, for example, that may provide real-time information on the level of stress or workload, as well as the development of technological and digital interventions that will be an issue. We know that multi-component and participatory interventions are more efficient, but in other contexts, and we lack experience in the context of digital interventions. Generally speaking, it will be important to incorporate ergonomic concepts, a user-centered approach, and participatory methods to enrich the design and use of algorithms, and also to develop OSH training focusing on digital technologies and new forms of work. There is a need to update OSH regulations and policies to avoid, I think it's a very important point, insidious deregulations and failure to respect labor law in some category of workers, such as platform work or forced self-employed. Updating must be sufficiently rapid to ensure that regulations and public policies do not lag behind the changes in practices resulting from the new working conditions. And as explained before, the review of the directive related to the health and safety on standard voluntary social partner agreements may be very useful for this. An important issue will be the questions of the compensations of MSDs, since the non-specific MSDs are expected to increase, and this form of MSDs are not taken into consideration by most of the compensation systems in Europe. It is the case in France, contrary to specific MSDs like CTS. To conclude, the world of work changed fast following the digitalization of the economy and the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been a booster. One of the key challenges for research and prevention will keeping the pace with the new and emerging digital technologies and form of work. But the digitalization will bring new and emerging OSH challenges, but also opportunities, depending on how the technologies will be implemented, managed, and regulated. And surveillance, risk assessment, interventions, and policies should be adapted to more flexible working patterns and form of employment. It is a great challenge. And generally speaking, the preventions in the digital world will rely on the promotions at the European level of more sustainable and socially responsible production models. I think that the Commissaire explained that at the beginning of the session. Thank you for your attention, and this presentation relies on this discussion paper.
Thank you very much, Yves. Are there any questions from the public?
Thank you for your nice presentation. I'm in Kögel, Luxembourg Health Ministry. Let's have a look in the future. Our younger generation, generation 2000 plus. What is the impact on work especially, or what will be the impact on work, especially digital work, by the noticeable change in the work-life balance approach by our youngsters? Do you have any idea?
Can you repeat?
Can you repeat it? I think that it was not...
It's difficult to hear. It's an aging process. I'm sorry.
Je vous le fais en français.
Oui, je veux bien. Oui.
Quel ça sera notre...
What about the generation born in 2000s that will see a different sort of work-life balance? So what will be the results, the outcomes with this new generation?
It's too early because it's a bizarre situation because the digitalization is in process, and the impact of the behavior of the young generations and their attitude for work, but also for the use of ICT, will be different from the others. But what we are seeing in the data is that there is an increase of addictions to screen, and probably we will have an increased risk of MSDs in the young generation because they are working at home. It's a kind of work, 8 to 10 hours per day, more than their scholar jobs. So, but we don't know. I think it will depend. Perhaps we will have no technology or see actions, and the young generation may also change and refuse to use technology. We don't know.
Don't you think they will work less?
Yes. It's a fact, and the youth have always will change the future. So it's difficult. People like me, very engaged in work, is difficult.
It all comes down to trust.
Huh?
It all comes down to trust.
Yeah.
The managers have to trust the workers.
Yes.
And yes, you will get some workers who abuse that trust, but that's always the case. I mean, there's no guarantee the person sitting at their desk in an office is actually doing any useful work.
But it is difficult for the managers to cope with this problem. It's a new problem, but we have no time to, no data, no epidemiological data to assess that.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions from the public? Yeah? We have one up.
Hello, my name is Manta Shareva. I'm a specialist, working as a specialist in Lithuania. I have a question about the workers developing MSD in the workplace. Can they expect any compensation, basically talking about law practice or something like that? Is there any data on that?
The question of the compensation will be that the definitions of the disorder is less clear than before, because there is no clinical typical sign differencing, for example, chronic pain from telework and domestic work, for example, for a young playing with his smartphone for many years. And the other problem is the question of attributable fraction to work factors that will be probably less important for, in my experience, in my lab, we have produced data on attributable fractions, and the attributable fractions is relatively low for non-specific disorders compared to specific disorders. So the questions of the criteria will be very difficult to have a criteria defining clearly pain, work-related pain compared to domestic pain or everyday life pain.
Thank you. I got the answer. Thank you.
But it's important questions for the trade union and for the employers, because this will be changed the game for compensation.
Thank you very much. We have now a question from one of our speakers and a comment from the other.
It's a comment from me.
Two comments, no questions. So Irene first and then Richard, please.
Okay. Now I just wanted what Armin said, the question about the differences about the generations, was it about, yeah? Also, we made some surveys with digitalations and we looked at the age groups and we looked at the youngest group in workforce. And we could see when the pandemic came, they had different problems compared to like baby boomers like me. And it was interesting because the baby boomers maybe at the beginning had more technical problems, but with the younger people, we could see they had problems with the life balance and they had problems with self-management. Yeah? So they didn't know when to make the break, when is the boundaries were blurred between, much more blurred, but in this generation, between work and private life. So this was one finding, but I don't know if it's representative. We just made, asked 2,000 people in Austria. So yeah. And the other thing is what we can see now in the young generations is they're not working full time anymore. They're working like 30 hours. But I think this is also maybe, of course, it's difficult if you look at we need skilled workers, but I think for life balance and for me promotion, it could be also an opportunity. So I'm not like many are blaming them or shaming them because they are working, they're not willing to work 40 hours, but I think also there's a chance there if you want to work lifelong, and they have to work longer, yeah? So, but that's, just a remark on this. Yeah?
Thank you. Just perhaps on a slightly lighter note, but it's well known, or should be well known, that the human body is designed for movement. And I'm often going around to office workers and saying, no matter how good your workstation is, get up and move around. My slightly off-the-wall suggestion is that we require companies, employers, to provide all their home-based workers with a dog. Because then they've got to get out and walk.
Thank you very much. That's a very good idea. Okay, thank you, Yves. I will now ask Małgorzata Milczarek, our head of prevention and research unit, to take the floor for a comment. Just a short note of introduction. She joined EU-OSHA in 2006 as a project manager. She has been working on projects on mental health at work, work-related stress, and other psychosocial risks such as violence and harassment. Małgorzata holds a master's degree in psychology from the Warsaw University and a PhD in work psychology, University of Silesia. Before joining EU-OSHA, she worked as an academic researcher in the Central Institute for Labor Protection, National Research Institute in Poland. Małgorzata, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurizio, for your kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. And I would like to start by saying a big thank you to all the speakers. And we had the opportunity and pleasure to cooperate with all of you during the course of the campaign, which resulted in the publication. Some of them were shown on the slides. So thank you for your input, thank you for your contributions, and it was a real pleasure to listen to you today. We heard a lot of evidence, we had a lot of facts, and we also had, thank you to the audience for your questions, some really good insights, and we identified already a number of challenges, and we don't have answers to all of them right now, but it's important to define them, and it's important to discuss and reflect on them. We heard that well, we are all aware that musculoskeletal disorders are multifactorial. We know that individual factors, we know that lifestyle contributes, we know that even our hobbies may contribute to development of musculoskeletal disorders. But the evidence is very clear. Work-related factors do contribute to musculoskeletal disorders. They can contribute to development of MSDs and to deterioration of existing conditions. And those work-related factors must be assessed and they must be addressed. And we know that there is a part of the good news in that. We know that psychosocial risks and musculoskeletal disorders are interlinked. We know the association exists. We know that factors such as work demands, like high work time pressure, we know that poor social support at work, these are the factors that contribute to development or deterioration of musculoskeletal disorders. But the good news is that psychosocial risks are also part of the solution. We heard that good social support, good social relationships at work contribute to the prevention of MSDs and are essential factors from when we look at the return to work and successful return to work. And we need to build on that. We heard about the importance of the holistic risk assessment, the risk factors for MSDs and psychosocial risk factors cannot be assessed, cannot be assessed separately. There must be the association of both factors must be taken into consideration at the risk assessment level, and also then later when the preventive measures are being planned. Now the challenges. A number of them were raised already. We heard some very convincing data from Italy. We saw the numbers. We also heard that in a way concerted approach. So there are different actors that must work together for the prevention of musculoskeletal disorders to be effective. We also heard about how digitalization is changing our workplaces and the associated challenges. The digitalization of work generate new psychosocial risks and new risks for MSDs, but also can make the other existing psychosocial risks more, the exposure to existing psychosocial risks more important, more acute. We also heard that digitalization often brings poorer social relationship at work. So again, the factor that is essential for prevention of psychosocial risk and MSDs. So the challenge and the question is how we can develop a working culture in new digitalized workplaces. How we can embrace hybrid work and how we can assure that there is a good worker participation in a situation when workers work 70, 80, 90% in their home. How we can bring them together when everybody is working in their own home. These are the challenges. Do we need new measures to deal with, to manage psychosocial risks? What is the role of line managers in hybrid work? There were very good questions, very important questions about self-employed and self-regulations. And we know this challenge is also relevant for workers, for employees. We know, for example, that work autonomy, in principle, is a protective factor. And it's a good thing, it's an important thing to have a work autonomy. But our other research that was carried out a few years ago shows that work autonomy is not necessarily a protective factor when it comes to musculoskeletal disorders. Because clearly, when we are left on our own, and when we employ our self-regulation, that doesn't always work for our good. And especially when there is a time pressure, and especially when it's high workload, and committed workers that are working at home, long working hours. This is the problem when we telework. What organizational measures, what workplaces can do to support this self-regulation? What measures we need to develop and employ to protect ourselves from ourselves? Another important issue is the younger generation and how we can talk to younger people. A few years ago, I was at a conference, and there was a professor who works with students, and he was saying that he discussed once with those students the right to disconnect, the idea that there was a discussion about the legislation, and what he said was indeed very important. He said the reaction he got from the students was not that he expected. They told him, "What do you mean the right to disconnect? Why we would need to disconnect? We want to be connected." We may have workplace measures and we can encourage this connection, but we know that disconnected person may disconnect from work, but they immediately will connect in some other ways. There's a number of challenges and important issues. Again, how we can create a new working culture, taking into consideration new forms of work, how we can build good social relations when we telework, how we can take of self-employed. And there is probably more research needed in this regard, but also new practical measures. I don't know if it sounds very negative, but maybe I will finish on a positive note. We need to remember that psychosocial risks are preventable. We can really do a lot, but by looking at our work culture, but assessing risks and addressing this risk in an appropriate measure, and by creating supportive and participatory work environment, we can make a change. The challenge is how to create this working culture in the new world of work, and how to make those new cultures sustainable. I would like to invite maybe the speakers to perhaps reflect on some of these issues, and I also would like to invite all of you to maybe share some experiences in your workplaces or from your countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Małgosia. We have time for a couple of questions more, if you have any questions for our speakers, for Malgosha, Malgorzata, it's your last chance. Yes, we have a question here.
Thank you, Reinhard Obermeier. We had a discussion this afternoon about risks today, risk tomorrow, and the future. We had been talking a lot about the new generations, and spreading my eyes through the room, where are the new generations? They have to be involved in this discussion. And I think it's much more important nowadays, because the change of the world, the change of the professional world is so increasing in its intensity and in the development, that for the new generation, they have to be somehow engaged in this process. Not only we. What can EU-OSHA do to get more and younger people in this process?
Well, just to mention that within the campaign we had a specific priority area that was on young future workers and MSDs. So identified, actually you have just sitting by you, Ulrike, who was the author of one of the papers that we produced within that priority area to addressing prospective workers. So yeah, that's Cristina, please.
I have a comment on new generation, because the problem is that they have higher competencies in digitalization, but less culture in health and safety. And the problem is, if they work mostly remotely at work, they don't have the occasion to improve their culture as regard to health and safety. I found a gap also between me and other my oldest colleagues about this, and I think that they not have clear the right they have in as regard to health and safety. So I think that initiatives for divulgating information for youngest about the culture of health and safety, as campaigns do, are really remarkable, because there is a need for improving their knowledge about which are their rights as regard to protecting themselves, their health.
Thank you. Malgorzata.
One aspect to add, we talked about the digitalization and the risks that digitalization brings, but Yves in his presentation also highlighted opportunities. So that would be also important to reflect and to see how we can use digitalization to improve the situation, how we can use digitalization to manage psychosocial risk and to prevent MSDs. There are not many good examples so far in this area, but there are already companies that there is already research that is going into that direction. So we should look at how we can build on that, and hopefully our next campaign on digitalization will bring into life many of such examples, because this is a process that we cannot stop, but we can try to use it for our benefit.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the next campaign hopefully will give some answers as well, but we are carrying out research, and we will explore more in depth all these areas that are still under-researched. So, yeah, Richard, please.
Yeah, I think actually one of the big steps, and you're moving us some way towards that, is recognizing a need to do something. Now, we may not yet know what we can do, but I mean, I'm very pleased to say, and I can't think why, that we're taking older workers more into consideration now. But we need to give that holistic approach across there. I mean, I've been to companies where their solution to the heavy manual handling problem for their older workers is to get all the younger workers to do it. No. So we need to have that thought and that thinking before we see some action.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think that we can conclude here, and thanks all for being here. Tomorrow in the plenary we will hear a summary of this workshop, so you will have some additional possibility to ask questions and clarification if you want. So thanks everybody. Thanks to our speakers. Thank you.